Kwame Nkrumah answering the call. With vision bright, he broke every chain. In unity we rise over struggle and pain. For God are free, stand with pride.
The man we come to know as Kwame Nkrumah was born on the 21st of September, 1909, in the small town of Nkroful in the western region of modern-day Ghana, a British colony known then as the Gold Coast. In Akan tradition, children are often named according to the day of the week on which they are born. For example, a boy born on Sunday is often called Kwezi, while a girl born on Friday might be named Afua. The name Kwame is usually reserved for boys born on a Saturday. However, Nkrumah's birth date fell on a Tuesday. It remains uncertain whether his parents gave him the name Kwame at birth, when they might have chosen Kwabena instead, or whether he later adopted it himself, perhaps drawn to its powerful associations with leadership, endurance, and spiritual strength. When speaking of Kwame Nkrumah, it's vital to first understand the political world into which he was born. Long before the British called it the Gold Coast, this land was a mosaic of powerful African kingdoms, royal states bound by trade, tradition, and lineage. There was Winneba, for example, home to the noble Gati family, the Boatengs, and other respected lineages that traced their ancestry through centuries of leadership. To the north stood the Ashanti, the Oyoko clan of Kumasi, famed for their wealth, military might, and complex governance system that rivaled any in Europe. This was not a land waiting to be discovered. It was already a land of rulers, scholars, and merchants. Royalty here was not bestowed by empire, but earned through service to one's people and the strength of one's lineage. But by the mid-19th century, that world was changing. At first, Europeans limited their presence to small coastal forts, trading in gold, ivory, and human lives. The interior remained largely untouched, considered uninhabitable by Europeans. That changed with the Industrial Revolution. Steam power, modern medicine, and new weapons gave rise to what historians now call the Scramble for Africa, a ruthless race between Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Spain to carve up an entire continent. In the early 20th century, when young Nkrumah was coming of age, nearly 90% of Africa had been claimed by European powers. The Gold Coast had become a British colony, its gold, cocoa, and timber enriching distant monarchs, while its people were made subjects of the crown. It was within this world of subjugation and resistance that Nkrumah's vision for freedom began to take shape. His father was a goldsmith, his mother a market trader, humble people living under a system built to enrich distant empires. Raised by his mother Nyaniba, Nkrumah attended church-run schools, the only kind available to Africans under colonial rule. Quiet but determined, he stood out early for his discipline, his sharp mind, and his love for learning. He devoured books, debated philosophy, and wrestled with one burning question: how could Africa be free? Among his greatest influences was James Emmanuel Kwegia Agri, a preacher and educator who taught that education and unity were the keys to Africa's salvation. For his ambitions to grow, Nkrumah had to leave home. In the late 1930s, with little money and boundless determination, he journeyed east to neighboring Nigeria in search of opportunity. There, he taught at Catholic schools in Hafasini and later Lagos, while continuing his studies privately. He read voraciously, saved every penny, and prepared for something far greater, a chance to pursue higher learning abroad. It was in Nigeria that his ideas about African unity began to crystallize. He witnessed the struggles of another British colony, a land rich in culture but stifled under colonial rule, and began to see the pattern of oppression that linked all African peoples. By the 1930s, he set his sights further across the Atlantic. In 1935, Kwame Nkrumah arrived in the United States, the land of liberty, only to find another kind of bondage. America in the 1940s was a nation at war abroad and divided at home. The Second World War raged across Europe, and millions of black soldiers fought for freedoms they themselves did not possess. They returned from the battlefields of France and Italy to a segregated America, one that still forced them to ride at the back of the bus and drink from separate fountains. In that climate, Nkrumah faced the harsh reality of racial injustice firsthand. He slept in parks, washed dishes, scrubbed floors, anything to survive. Yet by day, he studied relentlessly at Lincoln University, the first historically black university in America, and later at the University of Pennsylvania. He studied philosophy, theology, education, and political science, and more importantly, he studied life. By night, he worked as a janitor, saving every penny he could to live and continue his studies. It was the dawn of the early civil rights movement. Harlem was alive with the voices of thinkers, preachers, and radicals. Black intellectuals debated in cafes and churches about race, equality, and Africa's future. Here, Nkrumah found his tribe, men and women who believed that the destiny of black people everywhere was bound together. He devoured the writings of Descartes, Schopenhauer, and Marx, but none moved him as deeply as Marcus Garvey, whose call for Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad, became his gospel. Through Garvey, he came to believe that the mind was the first territory that had to be liberated. After nearly a decade in America, Kwame Nkrumah crossed the Atlantic once more, this time to London. It was the late 1940s, and the city pulsed with post-war uncertainty, but also with ideas. Anti-colonial movements were stirring across the empire, and London had become a gathering place for dreamers, radicals, and intellectuals from every corner of the British colonies. Here, Nkrumah enrolled at the London School of Economics, where he studied philosophy and political science. Yet his real education took place outside the classroom, in the smoky cafes, cramped flats, and late-night meetings where activists debated the future of Africa and the Caribbean. It was during this period that he met two men who would shape his political consciousness forever: Cyril Lionel Robert James, the Trinidadian historian and revolutionary thinker, and George Padmore, the fiery journalist and Pan-Africanist who had broken with Moscow to build an independent African liberation movement. Padmore saw in Nkrumah something rare: intellect, conviction, and the charisma to inspire a people. Under Padmore's mentorship, Nkrumah honed his vision of a united, self-governing Africa. In 1945, they helped organize the historic 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester. For the first time, this gathering of African and Caribbean leaders, including Jomo Kenyatta, Hastings Banda, and Du Bois, demanded not gradual reform, but immediate independence. The conference marked a turning point. As the old empires weakened after World War II, the colonies began to find their voice. It was there, in the charged air of Manchester, that Nkrumah's destiny crystallized. He spoke not only of Ghana's freedom, but of an Africa united, a continent bound not by colonial borders, but by shared struggle and hope. Among the many who passed through that circle was Ulrich Cross, a Trinidadian war hero and later diplomat, who embodied the brilliance and ambition of the Caribbean's post-war generation. Men like Cross, James, and Padmore formed a brotherhood of purpose, a diaspora network determined to reclaim Africa's dignity. And hovering over all of them was the moral force of William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, the great African-American scholar who had long preached Pan-African unity. Du Bois saw in Nkrumah the living embodiment of the ideals he had written about for decades, the bridge between Africa and its scattered sons and daughters. By the time Nkrumah left London in 1947, he was no longer just a student. He was a man transformed, armed with ideas, allies, and a mission that would change the course of African history. As he returned home, the air in the Gold Coast was heavy with expectation. The war had changed the world, and people everywhere were beginning to question empire. Yet, the colony remained firmly under British control. Power sat in the hands of governors and a small, educated African elite who believed change would come only through caution and compromise. The 1946 Gold Coast Constitution had introduced Africans to the Legislative Council for the first time, a symbolic gesture that many hailed as progress. But to Nkrumah, it was not freedom. It was the illusion of participation in a system still owned by the empire. He joined the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC, as General Secretary, eager to turn talk of self-rule into reality. At first, he worked within their framework: speeches, petitions, measured appeals to London. But the deeper he traveled through the towns and villages of the colony, the more he saw the truth. The people were ready for something more. Farmers toiled for pennies while their cocoa profits filled British coffers. Market women sold under colonial taxes. Laborers built roads and railways that led not to opportunity, but to export docks. For the ordinary Ghanaian, gradual independence sounded like another form of waiting for justice that might never come. Nkrumah's patience broke. While the UGCC called for restraint, he called for independence now. His message electrified the nation. Fiery, simple, and impossible to ignore. In 1949, he walked away from the old guard and founded the Convention People's Party, the CPP, a movement built not for the elite, but for the everyday man and woman. Students rallied behind him. Farmers left their fields to march. Market traders, the Makola women, became his fiercest supporters, selling goods by day and funding the revolution by night. Nkrumah gave the people something they had never been offered before, not reform, but freedom on their own terms. By 1950, the call for independence had reached a breaking point. Nkrumah urged the people to rise through what he called positive action, strikes, boycotts, and peaceful resistance against colonial rule. His words swept through the towns and villages like a drumbeat of defiance. To the British authorities, he was no longer just a loud voice, he was a threat, a man capable of turning the will of millions against empire. They branded him a troublemaker, a dangerous agitator, and in January 1950, they arrested him under emergency powers. But jail could not contain his movement. From his cell, Nkrumah became larger than life, a symbol of courage, discipline, and unstoppable conviction. Outside the prison walls, the Convention People's Party kept marching forward. Women led demonstrations, students organized rallies, and workers downed their tools in solidarity. The colony was no longer quiet, it was alive with resistance. Then came the 1951 general election, the first under the new constitution that allowed limited self-government. Even behind bars, Nkrumah's name was on every ballot, on every lip, in every marketplace. When the results were announced, the message was unmistakable. The people had spoken. The CPP won by a landslide, and from his prison cell, Kwame Nkrumah was elected leader of government business, effectively Prime Minister of the Gold Coast. The British, stunned and cornered by democracy itself, had no choice but to release him. When Nkrumah walked free, he was greeted not as a prisoner, but as a prophet returned. Streets overflowed with celebration. Psalms were written in his name. He was no longer just the voice of a colony. He had become the heartbeat of a continent, the embodiment of Africa's coming dawn. In the years following Nkrumah's release, the Gold Coast transformed into a nation in waiting. The CPP government pressed ahead with reforms, expanding education, improving infrastructure, and preparing a new generation for self-rule. Negotiations with the British intensified. The old colonial order was weakening, and London knew the tide of nationalism could no longer be stemmed. Across the country, a new spirit took hold. From the cocoa farms of Ashanti to the fishing villages of the coast, ordinary people felt themselves part of something historic. Flags were sown, songs were written, and the word Ghana, the name of an ancient West African empire, began to circulate once more. It was more than a name, it was a restoration of pride. By 1956, the momentum was unstoppable. The final elections confirmed what everyone already knew. Nkrumah's vision had become the will of the people. Britain bowed to the inevitable, agreeing to grant full independence the following year. And so, on the 6th of March, 1957, under the golden lights of Accra, history unfolded. Tens of thousands gathered at the polo grounds, their voices rising in song and celebration. The air was electric with emotion, a mix of disbelief, triumph, and hope. At the stroke of midnight, the Union Jack was lowered, and in its place, the red, gold, and green flag of Ghana rose to the sky. Then came Nkrumah's immortal words.
Good evening to you all. The Gold Coast will attain full independence on the 6th of March, 1957. The entire country has welcomed the Secretary of State's announcement that on the 113th anniversary of the Bond of 1844, the Gold Coast will become a free, sovereign, and independent state under the name of Ghana.
Though the British flag had been lowered, the structures of inequality still loomed large. Even as president, Nkrumah faced resistance at home. Traditional chiefs and regional kings, accustomed to wielding local authority, bristled at the new government's reach. Some refused to enforce new laws. Others saw the shift toward modern governance as a threat to their power. Greedy landowners clung to their privileges, unwilling to share in the nation's collective vision. To bridge these divides, Nkrumah called upon trusted allies, among them Ulrich Cross, the Trinidadian lawyer, war hero, and diplomat who had once stood beside him in London. Cross helped mediate with local leaders and neighboring states, navigating the delicate balance between tradition and progress. Together, they sought to unite Ghana's diverse peoples under one common identity, not Akan or Yu, not Fant or Ga, but Ghanaian. With that unity in mind, Nkrumah turned to nation-building on a scale Africa had never seen. He built roads, schools, hospitals, and factories, determined to prove that freedom could feed as well as inspire. He made education and healthcare free, declaring that knowledge and health were the birthrights of every citizen. He poured resources into science, technology, and the arts, founding the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology to nurture a new generation of African innovators. And then came his boldest vision, the Akosombo Dam, a hydroelectric colossus that would power the nation's industries and light its cities. Rising above the Volta River, it became the beating heart of Ghana's modern dream, a symbol of energy, ambition, and African self-reliance. But even as Ghana began to rise, Nkrumah's gaze stretched far beyond its borders. He knew that one free nation could not survive in a continent still chained by empire. The independence of Ghana, he declared, is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa. Under his leadership, Ghana became a sanctuary for liberation movements. Revolutionaries from across the continent, from Congo's Patrice Lumumba to Guinea-Bissau's Amilcar Cabral to Zambia's Kenneth Kaunda, found refuge, resources, and resolve within its borders. Accra turned into the beating heart of a rising Africa, a crossroads for activists, poets, and intellectuals who believed the sun was setting on colonial rule. In this spirit, Nkrumah invited great minds from the African diaspora to contribute to Ghana's rebirth. Among them was W.E.B. Du Bois, the legendary African-American scholar whose lifelong dream of a united Africa found new purpose in Nkrumah's Ghana. Together, they began work on the Encyclopedia Africana, a vast project to reclaim Africa's story, written by Africans, for the world. For a moment, it seemed as though the tide of history had turned. But beneath the surface, storms were gathering. Nkrumah's ambitions were vast, perhaps too vast for a young nation still finding its footing. His push for rapid industrialization and continental leadership demanded resources Ghana did not yet have. Then came the collapse of global cocoa prices, the backbone of the nation's economy. Revenue plummeted, and abroad, his stance against Western capitalism drew powerful enemies. To Washington and London, Nkrumah was no longer the celebrated face of African independence. He was a threat, a man who spoke of socialism, self-reliance, and unity in a world still divided by the Cold War. In January 1961, the dream of African unity suffered a devastating blow. Patrice Lumumba, the fiery young Prime Minister of the Congo, a man who, like Nkrumah, believed Africa must stand on its own, was captured, beaten, and executed. He was just 35 years old. Lumumba's only crime was believing that Congo's vast wealth should serve its people, not foreign corporations. But that vision made him dangerous, to Brussels, to Washington, and to the Western powers that still pulled the strings of African independence. Behind the scenes, the plot to remove him was already in motion. Colonel Joseph Mobutu, once a trusted ally, turned on him, backed quietly by the CIA and Belgian intelligence. Under their direction, Mobutu seized control of the army, overthrew Lumumba's government, and delivered him to his killers. His body was dissolved in acid, his name nearly erased from history. The message was clear, and it echoed across the continent. Any African leader who refused to bow to Western influence, who dared to dream of genuine independence, was marked. Lumumba had been like a younger brother, bold, uncompromising, and full of fire. His death confirmed what Nkrumah had long feared, that Africa's greatest battle was not just against poverty or corruption, but against the invisible hands of empire reborn, neo-colonialism. From that moment, paranoia spread through the corridors of power. Assassinations, coups, and foreign meddling became the new weapons of control. Nkrumah doubled his security, grew wary of Western diplomats, and spoke openly of plots to destroy him. In 1965, he published Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, a scathing indictment of how Western nations continued to exploit Africa through economic control and political manipulation. It was bold, it was fearless, and it did not go unnoticed. The CIA and MI6 began to watch closely, seeing in Nkrumah not a partner, but a problem. As the walls of isolation closed in, the dream that had begun with so much hope was now shadowed by uncertainty. But on the 24th of February, 1966, while Nkrumah was on a peace mission to Vietnam, the unthinkable happened. The Ghanaian military, aided and encouraged by foreign powers, seized control of Accra. Tanks rolled through the streets, the radio stations fell silent, and the man who had given Ghana its freedom was suddenly branded an enemy of the state. Nkrumah never returned home. He found refuge in Guinea, welcomed by President Ahmed Sékou Touré, who named him honorary co-president. From there, he watched from exile as his dream of a united Africa, his vision of progress and independence, began to unravel. Yet even in his final years, he never stopped believing. He wrote, he lectured, he planned. In 1972, Kwame Nkrumah died in Romania while receiving medical treatment for cancer. He was 62 years old. When his body was returned to Ghana, thousands lined the streets to mourn the man they once called Ozajifo, the Redeemer. He had been overthrown, betrayed, and exiled, but his dream refused to die. Kwame Nkrumah's legacy stretches far beyond Ghana's borders. His vision of Pan-African unity and fearless opposition to neo-colonialism inspired a generation of leaders, including Maurice Bishop in Grenada, who sought to fuse national liberation with social justice. Today, figures like Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso echo Nkrumah's warnings, challenging Western interference and calling for African self-determination. Across the continent, nations like France struggle to reconcile their past colonial actions with modern politics, a reminder that the shadows of empire still loom. The question remains, will history repeat itself? Or can leaders like Traore learn from Nkrumah's triumphs and mistakes, building a future where Africa's freedom is both political and economic, resilient against the forces that once sought to divide it? Kwame Nkrumah's story is not just the story of one man, it's the story of a continent's awakening, a reminder that freedom, once won, must be guarded, nourished, and renewed. Thank you for watching another Fresh K documentary. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and join us next time as we bring history to life, one story at a time.